Nice. So all that to say, the beauty of Wordle is you can only experience it kind of once, and then you gotta wait. Kind of like our Bible study, except I'm recording it. I'll send it to my mother. But I want to keep talking about Exodus, and I want to go back a little bit because last week we had our friend Audrey Moore come and talk about human trafficking. Exhilarating. Everybody wants to talk about human trafficking all the time. But we're going to come back. I'm going to review a little bit about Exodus. I did preach about Joseph this morning. It was kind of getting me in the mode of like, the beginning of Exodus and ramping up and all the fun things. But we had said 2 weeks ago, as a light reminder, come on. Oh, yeah. We're just going to jump in. Y'all ready? Pharaoh, afterwards, Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go." And he says, "Who is this God that I should heed him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord. I will not let Israel go." I'm trying to find the right space here. I do not know. And I want to talk about Pharaoh for a moment. Pharaoh is a word we have that's popular, that we know of the pharaohs of Egypt, made popular because that's the word used often in the book of Exodus in the Bible. They referred to Pharaoh. They didn't often call themselves Pharaoh in Egypt. They called themselves the king. While Pharaoh was like a minor title in a long string of titles, mostly the Jews who used that title. The king. And so sometimes you think of Pharaoh, you think of like the headdress, think of all this. Think of not just the king, think of the emperor, the emperor. Think of like the Roman conquerors. Think of Alexander the Great. Think of Julius Caesar. Think of the kings of Assyria, the kings of Babylon. This is the king of the known world. The Pharaoh that we're interacting with sees himself as the proxy of the gods. The gods have installed me. I'm here because the gods have chosen me and my lineage. I serve at the behest of the gods. I am the king of all. And there's thousands of gods in Egypt. The one thing that Moses would have known, the thing that Moses would have been trained up on, were the gods of Egypt. They would have been everywhere. There would have been temples everywhere. There would have been religious ceremonies throughout the year. And the Pharaoh functioned. This is, in many ways, like what Israel will become, not a theocracy, but a kingdom, right? He's a king on behalf of the gods, more so than Julius Caesar, more so than maybe other kings. But he's saying, of all the divine gods, I am here to represent them and lead you in worship to the gods. He carries around with him a staff. The king carries a staff with a serpent on the very top of it. And this is called the Uraeus. Maybe that's how it's pronounced. Who knows? Uraeus. If you're playing Wordle, you're trying to guess a word that has 5 letters. And it's like hard sometimes because they double the letters and that's really confusing. Or sometimes you get like 3 vowels and you're like, U-E-A. Like, what word has U-E-A in it, right? It's like very Uraeus. Okay. He carries around a staff. This is one of the symbols of the king. What are the other symbols of like the pharaoh or the kings of Egypt? The hat. What else? Fancy robe. The necklace. The flail. The crook and the flail. Right? The staff has a rearing cobra on the top of it, like he's about to strike. I think of like the old movie Aladdin, the original Aladdin, the good Aladdin, the cartoon that I was raised on, right? Where Jafar has the staff and like the little beady eyes kind of control the Sultan. The cobra supposedly protects the pharaoh by spitting fire at its enemies, but it's a sign of his power. It's the sign of his protection. His staff is a symbol of the office. So the king says very rightly, you tell me this Yahweh is commanding you to let my people go. Not your people, not his people, my people. They're working on my buildings. You saying let my people go. Who's Yahweh? I know I can name 2,000 gods off the top of my head. I don't know this one. And so what's the sign that Moses has? The sign, this divine sign. He says, he throws his staff onto the ground. It becomes a snake. I just love the symbolism that he takes the sign of the kingship and it throws his staff down and it becomes a snake. The magicians of the court, what do? They throw their staffs down as well. Oh, we're doing magic tricks now. We're all magicians. But then Moses' snake eats the snakes of the other magicians. Wow, that must have like taken some time for the snake to digest. It must have been really incredible to watch one snake just eat a bunch of other snakes. I don't know. There's a lot going on with that. This is, we think this might, the best guess is this is Ramses II. We believe that this is happening during Ramses II. A little bit before him, a little bit after him. Hard to say exactly. We went through why there's not a ton of archaeology preserved. While there's a lot of archaeology from the Egyptians, Ramses II loved to inscribe stuff to himself, especially where the Hebrew people are. They're working in the mud river delta. Things they're building up are being also washed back down. Things that are made of mud in the mud delta are returning to mud. There's not a lot of papyrus that survives in that area. And there's obviously not a lot that, the Egyptian pharaoh is going to be writing about his slaves. He's not going to well document his slaves in the same way that he will his victories, or the same way he will his conquests. Good morning, Carter. But Ramses the second, we know so much about him. As a matter of fact, you go to the British Museum in London, you can physically see Ramses II. He's there, like in person. One of the things they think about him, they did genetic testing. He has like a little hair on the sides of his head, but he looks like he's mostly bald. A good sign. His big old hawkish nose. Genetic testing, they believe that he might have had red hair. Red hair in the Egyptian community was seen as like this extraordinary blessing of the gods. So he might not have been what we're thinking of as like the dark-skinned, Egyptian type. He may have been fairly fair. May have been like really outstanding. Maybe he's a tall, redhead, Viking-looking guy. It's kind of shocking to behold. And all the other people in Egypt, saw him as a divine blessing from God. We know so much about Ramses because the guy told us about himself. Because he lives for over 60 years. And he goes and he builds cities, he builds temples, he builds monuments. He built Pi-Ramses, where the Israelites are going to be enslaved. He leads military expeditions throughout the Levant. The Levant is the Canaan area, right? That goes from Egypt all the way north through Canaan he's fighting the Hittites, which are going to be like Syria, Lebanon, and then they go westward into like Turkey, Greece. He's going to be fighting people like the Babylonians who are going to go east, so kind of going up, fighting people off that direction. Back and forth, they're going through the Canaan Valley the whole time, fighting and fighting and fighting. Part of it is this is a transition between the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. I keep telling you guys the same things, right? So that y'all are going to be one day repeating it back to me. It's a transition. They're transitioning to new technology. Iron makes better weapons, sure, better swords, better like chariots. The Bible will talk about it, how like David is the only one who can get a freaking iron sword to defend himself because all they have is bronze. But to do this requires massive amounts of minerals and technologies from all over this area. They have to go, to the east, into the west, and to the north and south to gather the materials, to trade, to buy, to sell, to conquer. But ultimately, you're not going to do it just for swords. The iron is going to help them plant. The iron is going to help them farm. The iron is going to provide more food, the technology that will help them sustain this huge civilization. Let's see. He built himself a museum. He has his own temple. Not only is Ramses setting himself up as God, he builds a temple to himself in real time, saying, I am God. He built on a scale almost unlike anything else. In the third year of his reign, he started the most ambitious project since the pyramids. The population was put to work changing the face of Egypt. In Thebes, the temples were transformed. My favorite thing that Ramses does is he doesn't just like build statues to himself. That he does. But why not just take existing statues and just change them a little bit? Like change the nose, change the face. He takes inscriptions to other pharaohs. Like, hey, Ramses the First was a really great guy. Just put in another little etching there, make it Ramses II. He changes inscriptions to reflect him. And what he does in part is he digs them really deep, as deep as it could possibly be done so that future pharaohs can't come and just erase his name the way he has done to other people. So he says, build everything to the glory of this guy. Here he is. What a handsome man. Y'all have seen statues of Ramses II. I would suggest Tutankhamun is like more famous on the tip of the tongue because of Steve Martin. King Tut, we know. But King Tut only ruled for a few years. He was a boy king. He died when he was like 18 or something. Like King Tut, he's just known in part because he was the last one found, and we found mostly intact. Once someone was thrown into a tomb, it was common in Egypt for tomb raiders to start almost immediately stealing stuff out of the tomb. So preventing those were really fantastic. I was just finished a book about King Tut, and they said one of the reasons why they think he survived, they saw where people were breaking in early initially, like right as soon as he's buried, and that the priest must have tried to repave it and hide the tomb. But then there must have been a massive flood because it was then buried under silt and mud, and then people couldn't find his tomb. That's why it's like so spectacular, is intact because they couldn't find it to steal all the stuff. Ramses erected colossal statues of himself. He moved the capital of his kingdom from Thebes in the Nile River to a new site in the Eastern Delta, near where we're going to find and meet the Israelites. He's building this new kingdom. I lived in Kazakhstan for 2 years. Y'all, I'm sure, familiar with Kazakhstan and all of its politics. But there was a president during the USSR days. He was like the head of the Kazakhstan contingency when they were part of the USSR. His name was Nursultan Nazarbayev. Well, as the USSR collapsed, this is all relevant to like what's happening in Ukraine today, right? USSR collapsed, all these countries trying to figure out what to do. He just became the president. And then he was the president for like the next 30 years, and then like set up his children to take over. You know, I wouldn't call it a democracy, but he moved the capital city, the capital that was down near the border of China. And y'all probably heard of the Uyghur population in China. They're being like systematically eradicated by the Chinese government. The Uyghurs are being attacked by them. The capital was in Almaty, close to the mountains of Western China, where the Uyghur people live. And he moved it to the middle of he just said, the new capital city is going to be in the middle of the country. We're going to call it Nursultan Nazarbayev. Can't imagine who that's named after. And he just like set up in the middle of like the Great Steppe. It's like in the middle of nowhere. It took probably 20 hours on train to go from the old capital to the new capital in the middle of the country, in the middle of the flatlands. But if you're self-promoting, if you want to build something to your own glory, moving the capital, naming it after yourself is a pretty great start. One of my favorite things about Ramses is that in this new capital city, he has his own temple, he has his own museum, he has all these statues, all these things to himself. He even has a zoo. And I love that. It's like, you know what we need up in here? Some animals. So more of Ramses II. So Moses comes and says, you think you're God. I represent the real Lord God. He throws down a staff. It becomes a snake. It's this great symbolism of like, you have the staff and you're king, but I have a snake staff. And okay. The king is not impressed. He says, get back to work. Moses and Aaron, why are you taking the people away from the work? We're building things to my glory. Pharaoh continued, now they're more numerous than the people of the land, and yet you want them to stop working. I said a few weeks ago, this was the trouble in Rome, right? There was a time when they thought in Rome, well, if we give everyone a cape, what if we give everyone who's a servant or a slave like a red cape so that we know that they are the slaves, not regular people mixing amongst us? Because the Romans didn't just enslave like Africans, they enslaved everybody. Anyone could be conquered. And so you have all these people who look very similar. We don't know who are slaves, who are servants. Give them all red cape. Except there were so many more people enslaved in Rome than not enslaved. They said, no, if they realize they'll rise up and overthrow us. They outnumber us. And that's scary. That's scary for us. So Pharaoh says, get back to work. And then, of course, what does he do? What does Pharaoh command for the people of Israel? In your homework, what did you read? Pharaoh, they have to go gather their own straw. He says, make more bricks, and we're going to give you less straw. You have to go and harvest the straw yourself. You have to go gather, which is doubling, tripling the work. The people come back. The people don't like it. Like, you know what? The Lord look upon you and judge you. This is the people back to Moses and Aaron. They said, they were excited. They were eager, right? When Moses comes and tells the elders, he's like, guys, we're going to leave. I'm going to free you. God is with you. God of all life, God of your ancestors is with you. And they're like, yay. And then they go back to work and they're like, make more bricks. And the people are like, oh, no, this actually sucks way harder. And so they complain. They go to Moses and said, the Lord look upon you and may the Lord. You've brought us into bad odor with the Pharaoh and his officials and have put a sword in their hand to kill us. It was bad before we're making bricks, but at least at night we could go home for like an hour before we passed out from exhaustion. Now we don't even have that. What have you done to us? So not only is Pharaoh mad at Moses, the people are mad at Moses. And this is the Odyssey. The Odyssey. What is the Odyssey? The Odyssey means the vindication of God. Somebody just invented the word, so you know. But I like it. It's like in the late 1700s, middle 1700s, somebody like came up with this idea, the Odyssey, the vindication of God. Because the one question you have to be asking yourself, the one question that now the Israelites are asking Moses, if you have a good God who's trying to do good things, then why are we suffering? This is the problem of pain. There's a book by C.S. Lewis that I think, for my money, the best book you can read about the Odyssey is by C.S. Lewis, like all things. The problem of pain. If God is good, then why do I suffer? Then why is life so bad? One of the things I dislike, you've heard me say it before, and then every time I say it, somebody gets upset with me, and somebody says, no, like, and they want to fight. But I don't like the Southern phrase. I don't like that Baptist phrase when we say, God is good. Everybody says all the time, God is good. I like the call and response. I like, but life isn't always good. And good is such a nebulous thing. And so if you expect God to be good and you to be good and life to be good, and then it's not good all the time, where does that leave us? Right? I don't like that phrase because I don't think that's the fullness. I'd much rather say God is faithful. Everybody says all the time. I'm like, all the time, God is faithful. Because I could walk you through the scriptures, which I will very slowly. I could walk you through the scriptures from the beginning of Genesis to the end of Revelation. And we say, this is a story not of the goodness of God. It's a story of the faithfulness of God. It's a story of God's faithfulness to people who leave, to people who stray, to people who fall apart, to people who turn their backs, to people who run away, to people who disavow God. God is faithful from the beginning to the end. But life isn't always good. And it's certainly not always good for the Israelites. And it's definitely not always good for the people in Exodus. So the people walk out and they say, if God is so good to come and rescue us, how come we're suffering? Why are we in pain? And this is an eternal question. This is like a question that every generation asks, that every person asks. When you go to the hospital and you're in like deep agonizing pain from food poisoning and you're dehydrated and you think you're going to die because like you just can't handle it anymore. And you think, wait, there is no God, right? It's hard to suffer. It's hard to suffer. It's hard to suffer physically. It's hard to suffer financially. I mean, in my sermon today, I'm talking about how it's an angry time in life. I think it's an angry season because it's hard. It's hard to lose your job. It's hard to be broke. It's hard to like raise children. It's hard to be overwhelmed with like the fear of things of, you know, COVID, pandemic stuff. It's hard to not know what's coming next. If there's another round of COVID coming, if it's safe. Even today, we saw the Queen of England diagnosed with COVID. It's hard to know. It's hard in these times of suffering to say, where is God? I think non-Christians kind of can use this as I would say, a non-deep philosophical bludgeon against Christianity. I would say it's not a deep philosophical question because we actually have philosophers who actually have spent hundreds, if not thousands of years asking these questions. We actually have theologians who go deep into these questions and reflect upon them deeply. And so why do we suffer? Where does suffering come from? Where is God in our suffering? It's not a mysterious question that no one has thought about. And so if somebody says, well, I don't believe in Christianity because, like, why would a good God let shit like this to happen? Well, in some ways I'd say that's only the beginning. And if you end with that, then like there's a lot of ignorance behind it. That's the beginning to a great conversation. Not only have Christians thought about this, ancient Egyptians thought about this. Ancient Egyptians had an entire theology around why are we suffering? What is happening? Because guess what? Every single person, except for this one, Jesus Christ, has died. Every single person in the history of the world has had somebody that they love that has passed away. And that this will happen to us as well, our mortal beings, right? So like our suffering and our eventual death actually is not surprising. It's the least surprising. It's like the most inevitable thing that can happen. So the ancient Egyptians have this incredible worldview, this incredible theology that understands every aspect of life, including pain and suffering. One of the reflections they had are there are many gods, and the gods can be capricious like us. I remember studying the word capricious on a note card for the SATs. I was in high school. Capricious. That they were capricious like us, that they were ever evolving and moody. There are some good gods and there are some bad gods. There's a good God and there are some neutral gods like Ra, where Ra, like the good and the bad alike befall from Ra, right? He is master God, and the idea of good and bad don't quite make sense when you're talking about Ra. When you're talking about lesser gods, when you're talking about Seth, right? Kind of doing terrible things to his brother Osiris, like murdering him, chopping him into 1,000 pieces, throwing him in the Nile River. Bad. Osiris, who comes back to life, resurrected by the help of the frog god Heket, who is the god of the Nile River, right? Pretty good God. So some of the fortunes and misfortunes might have to deal with the gods working through their stuff in our world. But no one god or goddess is fundamentally good or evil. They're complicated. It explains the bad things that could happen to good people if they angered a deity, if they angered one of the gods, because the gods could exercise the same free will with that the humankind possesses, because they had a concept of free will in the way that Vladimir Putin has free will right now. We're on the cusp of either World War III or just like some bad headlines for the last few weeks. And I'm hearing all these commentators about Vladimir Putin. Is he going in? Is he not going in? The thing is, nobody knows. Nobody knows except for Vladimir Putin, because it's not this humongous deliberative body who's talking, should we invade Ukraine? Vladimir Putin is thinking what's best for him, what's best for, I think, his wealth, what's best for maybe positioning his country, but ultimately for him. And I think he could change his mind. And here we are on the cusp of a humanitarian crisis. Here it could be that he takes his 150,000 troops, they push in, then NATO jumps in, and we begin a land war in Europe, which historically has never been great. That could lead to economic repercussions, that could lead to massive response by the world. At the very least, it's going to send Ukraine into chaos. Probably could cause huge economic crisis for Russia, where they lose trillions of dollars. It would definitely affect all of us in our stock market in America, plunging our financial system into chaos because war is not good for the stock market, because of the free will of one man, because Vladimir Putin has a choice to make. And the world is crying out. And it could be that thousands or hundreds of thousands or maybe even millions suffer because of his next choice. Free will. And the Egyptians understood this, that the gods like us have free will, and they make choices that are good and for evil. There's still a sense of justice, though, in the Egyptian worldview, right? There's still justice, because when you die and you go before the judgment throne, your good deeds are weighed. And if you don't receive justice in this life, there will be justice in the next, right? Brett, what's it weighed against? What they take your heart and they put it on the scale of justice, the feather of truth, right? And so even the Egyptians saying, yeah, there is pain and suffering, but that's not the end. There is life beyond this life. They had a very deep understanding of resurrection, but also of the afterlife, obviously, because they built whole pyramids dedicated to the afterlife, whole worldviews based on that. But this life isn't the end. and that the gods can restore you and give you justice. Now, this is a little different. We're going to talk about this a little bit more and then talk how this parallels to Hebrew theology. So there's this complicated afterlife. In Egyptian mythology, right, there is the beginning of all things. There's Ma'at, which is like stability and peace, and then there's chaos, Isfet, right? There's cosmic order, cosmic chaos. These two things are coexisting. Chaos preceded the creation of the ordered cosmos and continues to threaten its existence. In part, the Ra, the sun god is like leashed to the sun, and he's like has the I don't know, like some ray gun, and like he's fighting off Isfa every day, fighting off the chaos that's trying to take over the world. And if something were to happen to Ra and the sun were to not do its job in the sky, then chaos could return and swallow up the world as we know it. So it's this cosmic battle that's happening every single day. But in the Egyptian worldview, humanity chooses to behave chaotically and rebelled against the creator God despite his benevolent treatment to them. And so after defeating the rebellion, the creator God withdrew from direct contact with humanity. And it's in the distancing, right? So now the creator God, Ra, that permits the existence of suffering in the world because there's a disconnect, right? The people have rebelled against me, so I've squashed that. But now he's fighting chaos up here, and the people are left to somewhat their suffering on earth. From the Middle Kingdom of Egypt, the Middle Kingdom is precedes Ramses II. So from the predecessor, there's three kingdoms: the first kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, the New Kingdom, and they're separated by like global war, right? One kingdom ends as like the Babylonians come to power, or as the Assyrians come to power. Somebody comes and wipes out the Egyptians. So Middle Kingdom onward. So this is definitely affecting Ramses II. Theodicy. So this is the word I'm talking about. Theodicy is the question: why do bad things happen to good people? Why does a good God let bad things happen? Theodicy means the vindication of God, because it's the idea of the argument we make to say, why does this happen? So in the Middle Kingdom onward, theodicy, why the answer to bad things in the world, it formed the basis of the legitimation. This is why we have a king. We have a king because there's suffering in the world. The king helps us suffer less. Sometimes he uses a strong hand, sometimes he uses a violent hand to curb our human chaos, to curb our human tendencies to do bad. So sometimes the people rebel and the king has to come down and kill a bunch of people. Sometimes the king has to go invade another country and take them as slaves to build his kingdom. Sometimes the king has to impose taxes or take your daughters as wives, or take your sons or for warriors, or even take your money as tax. The king has to do this to help create and maintain order, right? Because Ra God is up here. You people have rebelled. You're left to your own human devices, which is not good. So now the king controls with an iron fist for you. This is for you. I hit you because I love you, right? I hit you because it's for your own good. You just needed to be taught. The correct human response to this state of affairs, therefore, is to demonstrate conduct in accordance with the ideal of Ma'at, one component of which is loyalty to the Egyptian state. Man, could this be replicated any other time through world history? I would describe this as the Chinese government right now. The Russian government right now. Like, yes, we only kill the journalist because we are maintaining order, right? Like, what a time to be a journalist in Russia. What a time. I would say this is how Russia, and certainly how the Chinese government views themselves. We only create massive humanitarian conflict and chaos to maintain order and stability of the country. And that ultimately there's a final judgment. So like whatever's happening in this world. Now there are some parallels to the Egyptian theology and to our biblical theology, our Hebrew theology, right? Before I get to it, what parallels do you hear? Yeah.
Well, it all rhymes.
It all rhymes.
It all rhymes, but what I'm thinking about with the Theodicy is this painting in Venice.
There's a painting in Venice.
Yeah, there are a bunch, but this one, it's of the final judgment, I think, and it's in this church, I think, that is right next to the Bridge of Sighs,
Okay.
which you go through this bridge to this prison that's hell on earth and you're never going to get out.
Yes.
Anyway, at a distance, this is just a gorgeous painting. It's huge. It takes up the whole back wall of the church. But if you look at it, there's all these images of suffering, and it's really horrible. But like the whole thing is beautiful.
The whole thing is beautiful, but when you get close, you see the suffering.
Yeah, and that just sort of reminds me of God.
Yeah.
And like sort of a major plan, but a lot of people get hurt along the way.
For sure.
I'm still thinking about it.
We're going to work to it.
15 years old when I saw this painting, so I may be foggy about the details.
We'll come back around to it because I'm going to kind of get to our Christian perspective. The first parallel is the very beginning of Genesis. You know, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. This is how Genesis 1 begins. Again, it's not written as a science textbook. It's not written to encapsulate all things, but this is the beginning. It says what? Earth was formless and empty, and darkness was over the surface of the deep. The Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. I love every one of these words. Every one of these words in Hebrew is profound and rich and important. Like the word Spirit of God. It's like the Ruach. It's a R-U-A. So can't be a wordle because it's only 3 letters. But the Ruach, it's like R-U-A-H, right? Ruach. There's like that sound in the back of your throat at the end. Ruach. The Spirit of God. It's the breath of God, right? It's like the wind of God. It's the sound that you make when you exhale. Like, you're exhaling, and it's the word that's going to be repeated as like God comes through the wind. God speaks on the wind, or the Holy Spirit comes down from heaven on the day of Pentecost, like fire. It's the Spirit of God that's moving. It's like supposed to sound like the sound that a baby makes when they suck in their first breath of air. Or even like the sound somebody makes at the end of life when they take their last breath. That, right? It's the Ruach of God. The Spirit of God moves. Now, these words, it's called Tohu Vavohu in Hebrew. Formless and empty. Formless, empty, and darkness. 3 words we translate are 2 words in Hebrew. From the Living Bible, they translate it like this. The first translation is like probably NRSV or something, or NIV. Second one is, when God created the heavens and the earth, earth was shapeless, chaotic mass. When the Spirit of God brooding over the dark vapors, that's from the Living Bible. This third one isn't the best translation, but I thought this is interesting. First, this, God created the heavens and the earth. All you see, all you don't see. Earth was a soup of nothingness, a bottomless emptiness, an inky blackness. I think this is from the Message. So there's like a lot of translation freedom in this. God's Spirit brooded like a bird above the watery abyss. I like this word, soup of nothingness. I think we're going to look at this word in Hebrew, but I think soup of nothingness, that's a really beautiful way to put it. Chaotic mess is another beautiful way to use these 2 words. That which is laid waste. This is from so the words tohu vavohu, these 2 words in Hebrew, tohu and vavohu. The first word tohu means that which is laid to waste. Like after a war and everything is ripped down, you think of like the bombings in Europe after World War II, where whole villages are just wasteland. It's the wastelessness. It's a desert or emptiness or nothing. It's just like ripped apart. That's the first word. Nothingness. It's like all gone. You walk out and you say, it's all gone. The other word is shapelessness, formlessness, like a blob, a soup of emptiness, soup of nothingness. It's just a blob that has no shape. It's primordial chaos. Primordial chaos. It's chaos before all things. We see this word translated as chaos in Isaiah. God will stretch out over Edom the measuring line of chaos. Wow, I love that. To me, this is reminiscent of what they're trying, of the Egyptian theology. Egyptian theology is before life, there's just nothing. It's chaos, it's swirling, it's mass, it's a mess. It's just a big old hot mess. And then something comes and calls it to order. It's order versus chaos, right? God says, let there be light, and he separates the light from the darkness. The Spirit of God moves and it begins to create this distinction. But the waters of chaos are never far behind. The chaos is always wanting to be unleashed on earth. So then it doesn't take us long. We go through only 5 chapters of Genesis, and by the 6th, the waters of chaos have returned. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart were evil all the time. Not dissimilar to the Egyptian mythology, that there was a great rebellion against God on earth. And so God came down and like squashed, and their lowercase gods, right, came down and squashed the rebellion of the humans. Well, in Genesis 6, God looks down and says, nope, it's only wicked. Everything's bad. You know what? I should just destroy it. I'm going to release the waters of chaos. I'm going to let the waters of chaos return and take everything back. It says God's heart was deeply troubled. I like this, that God has a heart that can be troubled. That God is not far removed from us. That God is not like Ra, who says, you know what, screw these people, I'm gone forever. That his heart itself is broken. And at the end of Deuteronomy, like chapter 28 of Deuteronomy, maybe chapter 30, somewhere between 28 and 30, in Deuteronomy, after God gives all these laws through Moses, God is ordering his community. God's saying, let's put us back together as a people. How do we live as a people? He says, I'm giving you order. I'm giving you rules. I'm giving you community standards. I'm telling you how to treat your poor, how to treat the widowed, how to treat refugees, how to treat the murderers. I'm going to tell you how to do it. You don't have to guess. Do that and there will be order. Live according to my plan. This is my favorite line. It says, and if you obey the Lord your God and you observe these commandments, then the Lord will elevate you above the nations and all these blessings will come to you in abundance. At the end of this, admonishment, he says, I'm giving you life. Choose life. And then he goes on to say, and if you don't do it, then you're going to kill each other. Then you're going to fight. Then your houses are going to be split. Then you're going to lose your land. Then you're going to lose your cattle. Then you're going to lose your health. And then you're going to choose death. Choose life. It's like when a family has a young, teenager, right? And you say, I'm telling you how to don't drink and drive, how to be safe, how to not put yourself in bad situations. I'm begging you, I'm going to send you to college. Choose life. Choose the right things. Choose life. Because we know how to choose bad decisions, right? Because we know what it means to have your heart broken. We know what it means to make bad decisions. We know what it means. So choose life. So God is in some ways still kind of giving this option of free will, in this primordial chaos and this primordial order are always close at hand. But in the Hebrew worldview, in the Hebrew theology, there wasn't a well-defined understanding or well-developed theology of the afterlife. You weren't living to get justice after death. The modern evangelical, non-denominational American Christian theology of heaven and earth and final judgment is probably closer to the Egyptian understanding of death, judgment seat, than it is to the Hebrew understanding of death and judgment. Because the Old Testament doesn't say very much about Judgment Day, isn't very overwhelmed by it. Because, for example, we take the book of Job. God's justice is given out in real time, in this life. God, you follow the commandments of God, and God will bless you now. What is it marked by? It's marked by health, like you are healthy, like you are strong, you are vital. And you have so much vitality that you can't keep it within you. You have to spread it out and be fruitful and multiply. You give your vitality and produce lots of children. That's how do we know that you're blessed by God? You have lots of kids. You have 10 kids. God must love you. They're all sons. You have done something in favor with God. You're an old man like Abraham and Sarah. You don't have any kids. You're barren your whole life. time to reevaluate some life choices. You have not been blessed by God and by land. That God gives his people land and say, this is your blessing. This land that you have, it's land where you can raise your kids, where you can raise your food, where you can have abundant life, where you can be safe, you can be protected. This will nurture you. This is what you need. It's not in houses, it's not in gold, it's not in temple, it's not in having your own zoos. Although having your own zoo, pretty cool. How do we know God is with you? Very little in the Old Testament, very little in the Hebrew concept of theology is there afterlife, final judgment, blessing. That's going to come later. Jesus will talk about judgment day. Jesus will talk about time when the sheep are separated from the goats. Jesus will talk about, and certainly we see in Revelation, the throne of God coming before God, right? But not to the Hebrews. So there is division here from the Egyptian theology, right? It's not aligned. And we're going to see in time through the book of Exodus where it gets further and further and further apart. But there are places where they start to rhyme, where you see, they echo each other. That doesn't solve anything because the people, so we go through all that conversation about theodicy. It doesn't solve anything because the people are still working, breaking their backs. The people are still suffering. And so they're saying, but where? But where is our help? So let me ask you, before I tell you the answer, I'll tell you my answer. So what is theodicy? Why is there pain and suffering in the world? Why do we suffer? Because of sin, because sin comes into the world. We live in a world that has sin. Because we live in a world where people can make sinful decisions that affect your life. Because Vladimir Putin, we live in a world where Vladimir Putin can make a decision to invade another country and trigger, global annihilation. We live in a world where that sin exists, that human freedom exists to hurt one another.
Yeah, it's our free will.
Free will.
I mean, God doesn't allow a lot of suffering. We allow it.
We allow suffering. We manifest suffering. Sure. What else? What else is the response?
I would say duality of life.
In some ways, we need the darkness to help understand the light. So if you only have light, you can't perceive light upon light. So in some ways, we need that duality. I know Tom is probably shaking his head and agreeing that there's some duality that we need, the yin and the yang. Sure. What else? There's also, deep questions of our own perception of suffering. My 5-year-old feels like she's suffering when I say, you can't eat that fourth sucker. And she lays on the ground and throws a fit. And she's like, you're killing me. I don't have anything good in this life. Why am I even here? Why, Lord? It's like, I only wanted this fourth sucker. That was the only thing I needed. But I'm saying, like, you're going to get a stomach ache. And then you're going to be in the bathroom crying because your stomach hurts. And that's also not good. And so some of it's perspective, right? Why do I have to suffer? Why do I have to suffer in this way? Sometimes we step back and say, well, by limiting ourselves or moderating ourselves or not giving ourselves over to all of our hedonist ambitions all the time is not suffering as it might feel for some folks, but actually long-term beneficial. There is some things like we exercise. You go and you run 5 miles, you bicycle for an hour and your legs are on fire and your legs the next day you're walking around like this and you're thinking my God, everything hurts. Some suffering that leads to actually a better quality of life. Some of that, sure. What else? I would say a couple things. This isn't a fullness of theodicy. But I'd say, first of all, what's frustrating to us is when God doesn't respond the way we want. In the ways that my kids get frustrated when I don't respond the way they want, right? So my daughter is having a fight with some of her friends and I say, well, Naomi, let's think about how you might have not been right in this. And she gets mad. She's like, oh, yeah, because I'm not responding the way she wants. And sometimes we get angry at God because we say, well, I don't want to have cancer. And so why doesn't God just take away my cancer? God's not responding in real time the way I want. And so now I'm angry at God. That has to do maybe more with my expectations. And also maybe our own trying to limit God. We're always trying to grab God by two hands and force God into our worldview and force God into this box of this is how I want God, and I want to control God, and I want God to live just this way and do just this thing. And that's what the Egyptians did. They would make their own graven images of their gods and put them in their house and say, now I want this God to do this thing for me, to give me more wealth and to help me raise my children, right? And yet God, the one thing we know is that we are not in control of God, that we do not have the power to force God into our image.
I was listening to a podcast recently, and I can't remember who the person being interviewed was, but their argument was all prayers are answered. And he said, you know, if you pray for something and you get what you want, well, that's an answer. But if you don't get it, that's an answer as well.
That God responds,
God responded that this is not,
just not in the ways you want.
this is not, you know, this is my answer. No.
That's what I was gonna say, sometimes the answer is no, and that's something that's really hard when you're younger, or maybe even when you're a teenager, but it was for me, but then you realize, okay, like you said, you can't limit God.
If there is a God, if there is a God who could like call to order cosmic primordial chaos, like nothing exists, it's a formless void, and God says bang and it begins, right? And God creates order out of chaos, and God who created the heavens and the planets and created our mortal bodies. The idea that we should understand the fullness of God is really vain, isn't it? Like, I don't understand what my wife is talking about half the time. You know, like half the time she's asking me to do stuff that I can't comprehend. And then that I should understand the mind of God is all vanity. The people are crying out, Moses, you're killing us. We have to make more bricks and we have to gather the straw. Now we look back and we think of Passover as the mighty act of salvation, the mighty act when God rescued his people. Oh my gosh, not only did God break time and space and enter the fabric of our time and our reality, right? That God is going to do these mighty acts of salvation, that God saved his people. Although it's going to get much worse. They're going to, no, you're not just going to make more bricks with less straw. You're going to wander in the desert for 40 years, starving to death, eating this terrible manna that tastes like nothingness. You're going to get so sick and tired, you're going to wish you died. But guess what? Then you will die, because not one person from that first generation is going to enter into the promised land. You think it's bad now, wait till you die in the desert. It's going to be significantly worse. It's going to get worse. It's going to get worse than you could ever imagine. The people are crying out saying, oh, we're making bricks. Our burdens are great. And God's saying, yeah, it's going to get worse. God doesn't come down and say, guess what? I'm going to remove that burden. I'm going to liberate you. I'm going to free you. Lou and I were listening to a speaker a couple of weeks ago who's talking about Daniel, and not Daniel Lanson, Daniel, the book of Daniel, talking about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Although there's a British reader, a woman who was British, who was reading that, she kept saying Abednego, and that got me all confused on how to pronounce the name. I'm going to say Abednego because that rolls off my tongue easier. They're like telling the king, we're not going to worship you. And he's like, I'm going to like throw you in this furnace. Like, we're still not going to worship you. It says he fires up the furnace so hot that the guys who are like feeding the fire and the coal into the fire, they die just from like trying to open it's just so hot. Everyone's dying. And then they get thrown in. That God doesn't prevent them from getting thrown into the fire. Like, they get thrown into the fire. And what does he say? The guards say, it looks like there's 4 people walking in there. Then we just throw in the 3. That God doesn't remove it all. He doesn't remove the fire. He doesn't send down like rain from heaven and put the fire out. But that God shows up in the fire with it. You know, you've heard me preach all the time about, I just don't understand when Jesus is walking on water and it's storming and the waves are crashing, and he looks to Peter and says, come on out, join me out here. Why doesn't Jesus stop the storm beforehand? Why doesn't Jesus say, calm? If I were Peter, it'd be so much easier to get out of the boat if there aren't waves crashing all around me. So then Peter begins to sink and he cries out, and Jesus rescues him, pulls him up. Then he calms the storm. That God doesn't necessarily calm the storm. That God doesn't reach down and just change everything and make everything perfect and easy and smooth like glass. But God doesn't abandon us either. That God says, yeah, it's going to get worse. It's going to get worse. You're going into the desert for 40 years. But I'm going to be with you. But I'm going to be with you every moment of the way. I'm not going to abandon you. I'm not going to leave you. I'm not going to forget you. I'm not going to walk away from you. Because in some cosmic order, this is part of the reality. In part, it's because God's taking this larger view, this cosmic view, this view that we don't have access to, this view that we can barely begin to wrap our minds around the edges. God's looking at this and saying, I'm looking at this great act of salvation that will be remembered for all generations. And maybe if he came down and he rescued his people from Israel, maybe if Moses goes the first time and says, can you let my people go, Pharaoh? And Pharaoh says, sure, y'all go have fun. And then they walk and it takes them like a week to walk into Israel. Maybe we never know the story. Maybe we don't remember it for generations. Maybe it doesn't get seared into the consciousness for thousands of years, celebrated until our own resurrection. You know, maybe God's looking through this cosmic perspective that we can't even begin to imagine. Also, we look at ourselves as the sufferers, and it puts us as the center of the story. I am the center of my story. My pain right now at this moment is the only thing that should matter in the world. And God, we're looking at every part of scripture from Genesis to Revelation. The story isn't Josiah-centric. It's not even Israelite-centric. The story is God-centric. That God's working towards this God goal of how do we reconcile all people to God? How do we reconcile all things back to the Garden of Eden where God and God's people are one and united? And so sometimes our suffering is out of our selfishness, that I'm focused on myself, that, oh, why can't I go do this dangerous thing? Why can't I go get super drunk and then drive around town as fast as I want? Because I'm putting myself at the center of the story. And I'm not looking at God as part of the story. And that ultimately, the God is with us. The God is with us through the times we understand and we don't understand our suffering. The God is real and the God is responsive. The God isn't always taking out our cancer, but the God is working in our lives even when we have cancer, even at those moments. And to say the cancer ward at UAB might be the holiest place. The holiest place, that's not true. The holiest place is where the preemie babies are at UAB. If you go to UAB, in the little walkway, the women's center between UAB and Children's, and you go where they have children who are in the NICU, that's the holiest place in Alabama. The second is the cancer ward, where people are sitting in the reality of life and death, where everything else strips away, your titles, your jobs, your money, your 401k, your retirement, every vanity, every pride you've ever had gets stripped away by chemo, by this new reality of life and death. And people are willing to ask real questions, reevaluate what is important in life, what does matter, what is the value of every breath I take. And now I've experienced this with people who've gone through cancer and survived. I've experienced it with people who've gone through cancer and died. I've experienced it with prisoners who were sitting in jail and said the best thing that ever happened to me was the worst thing that ever happened on the day I got arrested. The best thing that ever happened was the worst thing when I was sentenced to 10 years in prison that I desperately didn't want to go to. And it got me sober and it changed my way and it matured me. And I'm now ready to go back and live a life that I never knew possible. The worst thing that ever happened, the moment of my death, becomes the moment of my life. Or the person who comes back from cancer and says, now I'm ready to forgive and be reconciled to my son, who I threw out onto the streets. I'm ready to be reconciled to my father, to my mother, who I haven't spoken to in 20 years, because I now understand it from a new perspective. And so, look, we talked about theodicy all day, but I believe part of the answer, and this is the joy of being Christian, right? We get to talk about these things endlessly. We can talk about it more and more on layers upon layers upon layers. But I think in part, my response is that God comes from a cosmic perspective that we can't perceive. That God comes from a God-centric rather than our own self-centeredness. And that God is present with us. That God is with us in our good times, but especially in our suffering. If you want more about this, we'll do next Bible study on Job. So we'll come back to it. Let's just stop right there. So we covered like 3 lines in Exodus. So we have more to pick up on next week. Next week, we're going to start with the plagues. As a matter of fact, almost all the work I did this week was on the plagues. So I have a lot to say about that next week. But do y'all have thoughts or insights or reflections on theodicy?